and just switch to the modality. Yes. Donc, c'est Brenden Lake de l'Université de New York qui va parler d'apprendre à travers les yeux et les oreilles d'un enfant. Brenden est professeur dans le département de psychologie et au centre de la science des données à l'Université de New York. Il utilise les progrès de l'intelligence artificielle pour mieux comprendre l'intelligence humaine et vice-versa. En sciences cognitives, si les gens ont capacité au-delà de la portée des algorithmes, alors nous ne comprenons pas entièrement comment ces capacités fonctionnent. En IA, en intelligence artificielle, ces capacités sont des problèmes ouverts, importants, avec des opportunités de rétro-ingénierie des solutions humaines. Avec ça, with that, I'm going to pass the driving over to Brenden. Welcome, Brenden.
Thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me, Stephen. And I just want to say that this is new work. This is a new talk, so I'm happy to take questions as we go. I might forget to explain something important. And it's a new talk, but I had help from this amazing team putting it together. Okay, so the three names.
It's fine. One suggestion, Brenden, because it is a multilingual audience, try to speak slowly.
Okay.
And how should I say? Minimize the colloquialisms because they won't understand. Some won't understand. Go ahead.
Increase the volume.
Okay.
Oh, increase the volume. Just a sec. Somebody asked.
Yes.
J'aurais besoin de... Peux-tu...
Yes, I can. Tu veux y aller?
Oh, je vais y aller.
Sorry.
This happens every time, so.
No worries.
Likely, that's the right.
Say something, Brenden.
Yes. How's this?
Is it better? Great. Yes, terrific. Thank you.
No
Let's see.
Okay. As I was saying, I had help from this amazing team putting this together. The top three names are the three project leaders. There's going to be three parts of the talk, and part one was led by Amin Oran, part two by Wentao Wang, and part three by Wei-Keen Vong. And Na-Jung Kim and Guy Davidson were also important contributors to this work. So this really was a team effort throughout the lab. The last several decades have brought an increasingly rich picture of the infant mind. So here's a chart from a major DARPA machine common sense program that's happening here in the States, which outlines a wide range of cognitive milestones and rough ages by which children achieve these different milestones. So on the rows here are different milestones that children achieve, and then on the columns are an estimate of roughly when children typically achieve these milestones. And you'll notice that it's within just the first 18 months. And it's organized into three domains in the different colors, the objects in orange, agents in blue, and places in green. And I just will read a couple rows to give you a flavor, right? So within the first few months of life, infants understand that objects have depth and can move in 2.5 or 3D space. They can move separately from one another except on contact. For agents, they can change object motion and they have goals. Or for places, that agents tend to navigate to goals by the path of least resistance. Again, a tremendously rich picture of the infant mind. And beyond objects, agents, and places, Emmanuel Depew has constructed a similar diagram for language perception and production. So there at the top is language perception, organized by ability, and also an estimate of when infants show some understanding of these cues. You can see that can go from language prosody to proper names to familiarity with some frequent words or segmentation of words and sentences, and of course, eventually word production within the first 2 years of life. So I want to zoom in on a couple infant abilities related to categorization and word learning, which are the topics we're going to consider today in this talk. So by 3 to 4 months of age, infants can discriminate some common visual categories. This is the work of Paul Quinn and others, where if you show a number of images of dogs and then show an infant a bird, that they'll be surprised and notice that something has changed, or vice versa. You show them birds and then you show them an image of a dog. And by 6 months, infants seem to know some objects by name, in the sense that you can show a picture of a mouth and an apple and have a recording of saying, look at the mouth. And 6-month-olds will look longer at the mouth than the apple on average, right? Or the same for look at the Jews. So this brings us to the key questions at the heart of our project here. What is the origin of this early knowledge? And how much knowledge can arise through generic mechanisms applied to sensory data, and how much required more substantive, possibly innate inductive biases? So of course, this is a modern reformulation of the age-old nature-nurture question. And of course, we don't aim to resolve this question in the fullest sense, but to provide a complementary lens to the empirical work that tests infants and children in terms of their early abilities. And our lens is instead going to be about what is learnable. So what type of knowledge can we learn and practice using today's machine learning tools and new developmental data sets that give us access to what the world looks like through a child's eyes and through their ears. So there are 2 ingredients for addressing this learnability question. On the left, a close proxy to real first-person experience, like a baby wearing a head-mounted camera, recording video and audio. And the second key ingredient are machine learning models with general inductive biases. Here we have a vision transformer model. And since we're after what's learnable in practice, we aren't going to restrict ourselves to psychologically plausible learning algorithms. We want to know what's learnable both in practice and in principle. So the algorithms we're going to use we're not going to restrict ourselves to psychological plausibility. We just want to know if some generic learning algorithm applied to the type of data that children receive, what is it able to learn? For this research program, we want to get at this question, as I've been saying, how can sophisticated representations emerge from one baby's experience? And our approach to train machine learning models on a strict subset of one child's experience. And this is important. There's been previous work that has made interesting discoveries and findings training machine learning models on aggregate experience across many children. But to understand what's learnable through the data available to a single child, you really do need to train models on data from a single child as well. The models are trained self-supervised, meaning there's no extra labels. We try to provide no unrealistic form of supervision, no extra labels that the child wouldn't have access to. And I want to say that our work so far has focused on visual linguistic and visual linguistic representations, but there's much more to explore. The data set we're going to use is called SACAM, and this is not from my lab, but is a multi-lab project led by Jessica Sullivan at Skidmore College. And we are so incredibly grateful for this resource. It has made our work possible. If you haven't seen this resource, check out their paper, which was in 2021 in OpenMind. And the data is also available to those that have IRB certification through their university. You can download the data set on a resource called Databrary. But it's clearly a tremendous contribution to science of this unprecedented data set, and we and others only beginning to scratch the surface for the science that it's going to make possible. Here are some of the specifics of the data set. I'm going to show a little clip of what it looks like. So it's longitudinal audio and visual recordings over 26 months of age of a child's life, the beginning around 6 months of age, and the recordings end around 32 months of age. Now, it is not, of course, a continuous recording of everything the child saw. It's really a brief snapshot at the end of the day, but nevertheless, a really powerful data set for investigating the questions we're interested in. There's 3 babies. Baby S is the one we're going to focus on. That's our main data stream, and it's over 200 hours of video collected over this 2-year period. And they roughly collected 1 to 2 hours of recording per week. So it's this longitudinal data stream of video and audio over these 2 years. And here's an outline of what we're going to cover in 3 parts of this talk. We're talking about vision-only learning. The second part is going to be about language-only learning, and the third part is going to be about joint visual and language learning. And let's just dive right in to the first part, and this is work led by Amin Oran, a postdoc in the lab. And he's been training these vision-only models, which really serve as the backbone for a lot of other work that we're doing. But here is the main model class for learning visual representations from SACAM. We use a transformer architecture, which is a highly generic, very popular type of neural network. And it's generic because it's used for a lot of different domains. It can do image processing, text processing, speech processing. It can do control and reinforcement learning. The basic idea is that the network summarizes an image, in this case, using a vector embedding. So in comes the image. It's broken up into patches. Hopefully you can see my mouse here on the screen. It's broken up into patches. These patches are processed with many layers of neural network processing. And ultimately, there's going to be a single vector embedding of size 760, which comes out with 760 different features, which is going to summarize what was in this image. So to give you just a broad sense of what a transformer does, if you haven't looked at the details of this architecture before. Right, so each of these different patches is going to do a learned linear transformation. They're going to be flattened. So each of them are going to be feature vectors themselves, but very, very low level pixel-based features. Now, each of these patches are now a vector, and they're going to be processed with a layer of the transformer. And in essence, what that's going to do, it's going to keep a separate representation for each of those patches, but it's going to incorporate context from the other visual patches. And then you just do this over and over again for many layers of processing. In this case, the best model that Amin trained has 12 layers of this transformer-based processing. And at the end, we have the special channel that we use to extract the general embedding for an image. The best overall network, to give you a sense of the scale, has 85 million trainable parameters. And this isn't just the first architecture we tried. Amin has been very systematic in terms of training and testing different models. And he's trained over 48 different models, varying in the algorithms for learning, the architectures, and a number of other factors. And he estimated that there's been 770 days worth of GPU compute time on like the best GPUs we have here at NYU, all learning through the eyes of these children in order to find like the best model class, which we're going to use for our experiments. But here's the main self-supervised learning algorithm. So I told you about the architecture, and happy to take questions on that as well as the learning algorithm. But the learning algorithm we're going to use is called Dino. And the key point is that 2 views of the same image should have a similar representation. And thus, we're going to be able to train this vision backbone model with no category labels and no extra supervision. So how this would work is we take an image, which is one of those still frames, and we're going to make 2 copies of it that are going to be different views or different transforms. So different cropping, different colorization, sometimes even grayscale. So we get 2 copies that look different from the image. And we're going to ask the neural network to make sure that the embedding, the vector representation of those 2 images, is similar to each other, because in fact they arise from the same video frame. So on the left here, we're going to have a student network, and on the right is going to be a teacher network. And the hope is that their high-level representation of that image is going to be similar. So that's the basic way that Dino works. And there's an important trick that you need to do with Dino to prevent collapse of the representations, because you might imagine that if it learned the same representation for every single image, like a big vector of zeros, then it would be successful at pushing any two copies of the same image together, because any two images would look identical to the network. So the trick to prevent this type of collapse is to have the teacher network not be an exact copy of the other network, but kind of a decayed copy that's going to average the parameters over a period of steps in the past. And that provides the stability that you need in order for the network to learn a good representation that's invariant to changes like different crops or minor variations in color and blur and so on.
Okay, I have a question.
Yes.
You said that this was a self-supervised, unsupervised network, and you said it as if you were proud of that. I wanted to ask why that's a good thing.
Right. Well, my colleague Jan LeCun here at NYU has been advocating for a number of years that self-supervised learning has to be the primary mode of learning in humans and animals, because we learn so much, and the labels really are quite sparse that we have access to at the end of the day. But in a way, what we're doing here is a project of testing what we can learn from the type of supervision children have. But importantly, we don't want to give the model any supervision that the children didn't get. So the way these systems are typically trained, right, when they're supervised, like an ImageNet trained model is going to have a very large number of labeled images that were hand labeled by adults with a number of classes of different types of images that were taken by photographers, right? And then those models have been used for all sorts of applications and also for studies in psychology. But it has this very unrealistic training data, and also it's trained in an unrealistic way in terms of requiring these hand labels, which children may not get. So in this case, we're not using any labeled information. We're just using different views of the same image. But I will tell you about in the third part, Wei-King Fong's work, where he is going to use the language information stream as well, which is going to provide a type of weak labeling, but of the sort that children actually get. Well, it is derived directly from the experience we see in the data set.
Okay, thanks, Brenden.
So here's our main evaluation, which uses a standard linear probe technique. And so we're going to learn this vision backbone model. And what we're going to do after it's trained self-supervised is we want to know how it can do a new task that might actually require some supervised labels, despite my speech against supervised learning just a minute ago, right? But the key thing is we're not going to allow it to learn any new features. We're going to take the fixed 768 high-level features that it does learn to represent the image, right? And then we're going to try to train a linear classifier on top of those features, which would allow those features to be reweighted in a new way in order to try to solve a new task, a task that is going to require unrealistic labels, because we want to know how it can do on some downstream task, but it can't change the features because the trunk of the model is frozen. I see there's a question in the chat, but it's in French. I don't know if you want to translate.
Let me find it. Go on ahead in the meanwhile.
Okay, thanks. So here are the evaluation tasks that we look at. There's going to be 6 downstream visual classification tasks evaluating different types and aspects of visual recognition. So task 1 is called labeled S, which is 26 different classes that are actually going to be drawn from the SACAM data set. Those are going to be classes like car and road and hand and foot and ball and toy and so on. This image data set from Talia Conkle, which has everyday objects, they're segmented from their background. We want to know how we can do classification there. We want to know how we can do classification on Core 50, which evaluates transformations of small objects in realistic scenarios. On ImageNet, which I already talked about. On EcoSet, which is a more psychologically realistic version of ImageNet that has more psychologically typical categories. And also place classification tasks. So we want to know if our features are going to be capable of all these different types of tasks. We also looked at 2 downstream segmentation tasks, one using COCO, which is a lot like ImageNet, but the images are segmented into different objects and then labeled with their object type. And we want to see if we can extract that type of information. And also a video segmentation task where you get the segmentation for the first frame. And we want to know if our features are useful for propagating that segmentation across multiple frames of video. So how can we learn through the eyes and ears, just the eyes in this case of a child? Well, and overall, how well can we do through that child's eyes as captured through this data set? An overall summary is on the left. So on the y-axis here is going to be the normalized score of the model, where we're going to take a self-supervised model on ImageNet, trained, a visual transformer trained with Dino, which isn't far from the state of the art in computer vision. And we're going to treat that as the normalized score, the upper bound, right? A near state-of-the-art computer vision model. And we want to know what percentage of that state-of-the-art can we achieve by learning through the eyes of the child instead. So what we're showing here on the y-axis is that normalized score averaged across the 8 different tasks. And the different gray dots here are the 8 different tasks. For the models in orange are the ones trained through the baby's view for the 3 different babies, and then all 3 babies together. But baby S is the one that you can focus most on because that's what we're going to use throughout this talk. ImageNet 100 is going to be at 100. ImageNet with 100% of the training data. But notably, the model trained on one baby's data set is about the same as a model trained on 10% of ImageNet. So that's a comparison we'll make again in the next slide, but is a nice way to estimate like how much power in terms of visual features you're able to get. It's much better than random features. So without any learning, it's a dramatic difference, and that's shown here in green. Yeah, so there's a question in the chat, what exactly is the metric in terms of the composition? So that's a good question. I'll break it down here in terms of the individual tasks. So there's those eight different tasks, right? And each of them has a different metric and baseline, but we're able to aggregate them because we compare them in terms of percent of image performance. And if you look at labeled S, which is that within domain labeled set of images from the babies, actually the orange bars, the baby trained models, are better than the ImageNet models, which I think is quite neat. So within distribution, you actually do better training through the eyes of the baby than you do train on ImageNet. But if you then test on ImageNet classes, again, that's just that linear procedure with no new features, the ImageNet model are much better, which isn't a surprise. But then across the other types of classification tasks, whether it's those segmented objects on white backgrounds, if you look at this bar, which is the baby S trained model, and this bar, which is the 10% ImageNet, they're pretty similar in terms of performance. And that's true across EcoSet. That's true across the COCO segmentation task, across the Core 50 task that looks at different types of transformations and also place recognition. So this is just a bird's eye view, but it shows that we do learn useful high-level visual features that can perform a range of different tasks. And when compared to a state-of-the-art system, it looks like it's about the same as one of those models trained on 10% of the images in ImageNet, which would be about 120,000 of these photographer produced images. So this plot was just the average of those 8. In addition to learning a discriminative model with strong visual features, we can also train a generative version of the transformer. So here is the same type of architecture, but trained in a generative way. So rather than taking the whole image as input, it's going to start with this a special symbol, and then it's going to produce a discrete code, which is going to code for a certain type of image patch, which another vector quantization model is going to then decode into a particular patch. And then that's passed back in and it produces the next patch, and so on. The same architecture, the same type of architecture, but now trained in a generative way. And this is known as GPT, which I think everyone is probably familiar with at this point, the same type of model as in GPT-3 and ChatGPT, but here we're going to be generating this discrete code for coding for different sort of image fragments. And we want to know, can you actually generate images when trained on the baby's view? So this is what unconditional samples from the model looks like. You can see that They do actually look like the types of images in the data set, and you can even see some structure like cribs and some faces and some toys and books. What we do want to know, is it just memorizing? Because it has a lot of parameters. This is a much larger model, 730 million parameters. So in order to figure out the degree it's memorizing, we can look at a complete the image task. So how this task works is we're going to train the model on one baby's frames, and we're going to prompt it on another baby's frames. So these are images it hasn't seen before through a different baby in a different environment. And what we're going to do is look at the top half of the image and then try to predict what the bottom half looks like. Right, so the top half of the image is going to be given as a prompt if you follow my mouse, and then the bottom half was going to be masked out, and we're going to try to guess what was there. So at the top is the original, so you can see this, this is a person and their arm stretching over some books. And what does this generative model think is there? Well, it certainly tries to continue an arm. You can see it's not always successful in terms of actually like ending where the arm might be in a practical sense. But it does a pretty good job of predicting like what the second half of this child's playmat environment is going to look like, or what the second half of this bookshelf is going to look like. Again, these are 5 different samples from the same generative model. And I'll give you some more examples. Here's an interesting case, where it's completing like what the second half of this dining table scene looks like. So it's pretty good at figuring out how a table might end. But for this case of the person, where you only see the top half, and this is what the actual image looks like, the model can sort of complete the clothing, but it tends to like add this very general like robe rather than the specific details of like how the body and the clothes like would actually be generated. So you can I think that's a good summary of like what it's capable of in terms of its generative abilities. And here's an example of like completing a baby's sort of high chair. And the degree to which it knows, like it's certainly good at very general visual patterns, like Gestalt-like cues. It seems to be incredibly good at sort of guessing broad completions in terms of visual patterns. But the degree it knows about specific objects or knows how to place them, that's a little less clear, and we're still figuring that out. But one way to investigate the specificity is to test it on objects in isolation. So you can go back to those Conco objects, right, which were objects segmented on white backgrounds. And we can, again, ask to complete the second half of the image with samples from this generative transformer. Now, in order to get the network used to producing single objects on white backgrounds, which is not the type of data that it's trained on at all, we fine-tune it on 2,000 images of objects on white backgrounds, and then we ask it to produce this for new images. And then it's much better in terms of if it can complete reasonable predictions for the second half of a clothes hanger or a key or a keyboard. In the case of this doll, right, again, it kind of has sort of a somewhat strange, like very general completions, but the legs of the chair are quite good. We're still trying to figure out if it's copying from other objects during the fine tuning, or whether it has more general knowledge from that pre-training. So we're doing more rigorous splits to figure this out. But I'm excited about this tool for like more detailed probes in terms of the specific category knowledge that these models are able to learn through the baby's eyes. I see there's a question from Stephen. Is the completion of specific images or completion of images of objects of the same kind? So in this case, like, yeah, it's possible that some of those fine-tuned images are like could consist of another chair. So that's exactly why what we're running now is a split where we're gonna like do the fine-tuning on just living things and then test it on furniture, right? And we do that, we could be certain that if it is good at completing furniture, then that knowledge is coming from the self-supervision rather than the supervision. So what can we conclude so far? So Amin showed that based on visual-only training solely on one child's experiences, the machine learning models with very general inductive biases can learn strong visual representations. And the emergent features are broadly useful across 6 different categorization, 2 segmentation tasks. The performance is equivalent to about a 10% ImageNet trained self-supervised model. The network can learn powerful generative models through the eyes of a child, but the jury is still out on exactly what they know specifically. And 2 limitations of this current case study is that it currently ignores the spoken language input. And in many cases, it relies on these trained linear decoders to help interpret the representations and see what tasks they can do. And these are limitations we're going to remove in the second and third part. I'll pause for a moment and see if there's any questions there before I move on to the second part.
I have a question just regarding the collection of data.
Yeah.
Are you looking through images that are usually high definition, or does it matter whether it's blurry or not? I'm just thinking about babies that maybe don't have full vision.
Yeah.
Because I know when I gave birth, they told me babies didn't know a lot of colors, or they didn't see properly until a certain time, etc. So does it matter to you what the quality of the image is for your model?
Yeah, that's a great question. If we were working with like data from a newborn head cam, then certainly I think you would need to account for that, the dramatic changes in vision over the first few months. But by the time they're 6 months, their vision is pretty good. And that's when the data set starts. But it's a good question. And the camera itself is not, it was collected years ago, and it leaves plenty to be desired in terms of the resolution of the data set currently, but new versions are being collected with high resolution cameras and so for video and audio. And so we'll have more to look forward to.
Got it. Thank you.
May I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So during training, do you perform continually, like following the time sequence the video performs to train the network, or you do the batch training stochastically, like how do deep neural network usually trained?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great question. We're doing the standard thing, and Amin has tried incorporating the temporal information into the self-supervised learning, where you can push nearby frames to be also similar, and found very little, if any, gain compared to treating the images as static. So what we're able to do here is only on the static frames kind of shuffled. And I think self-supervised learning is going to have to advance for us to more completely incorporate that temporal information, which is essential for so much of what children know. But when we're able to do that, the models are going to be able to learn much more.
Thank you so much.
All right. For part 2, this was led by Wentao Wang, who's a master's student in the group and here in NYUCS department. And Wentao led part 2, which is about language-only learning. So in this section, we follow in the tradition of Jeff Elman's pioneering work on finding structure in time, where in 1990, Jeff Elman trained a recurrent neural network on simple artificial sentences and analyzed emergent structure in the representations of these words. So this is what Wentao did, but rather than using artificial sentences, Wentao is actually going to use the utterances that a single child had access to. So in fact, Wentao's title of his preprint, which you can check out on SciArchive, is called Finding Structure in One Child's Linguistic Experience, as an homage to Elman's pioneering work. Just as before, what kinds of knowledge, what kinds of linguistic representations are learnable from one child's experience? The snapshot available for use from Baby S is over 37,000 child-directed utterances that have been transcribed. We're not using the raw audio, so we're going to assume that there is word segmentation and that the transcripts aren't a terrible proxy. So what this actually looks like is you have these video clips, right? And then you have these time-stamped transcriptions. In this case, playing like the hide the ball under the cup and move the cup around game. And the child hears, okay, see the ball, there's the ball, where's the ball? Oh, where's the ball? Is that the ball? So this, in part 2, we're not going to consider the images. They're going to come back in part 3, but the models are just going to be trained on those utterances. See what you can learn about linguistic structure. And here's another scenario. Reading, you'll see a book about a farm and a cow, and here is a farm with a cow on it, and the cow has an udder, and the milk comes out of the udder. And do you want to go back to the farm sometime? Yeah, we might go back to the farm this weekend. And then you have to pour the milk and pour that milk in the buckets, and the buckets go in the big truck. Right, so this is the type of experience that children get. And we're going to train on those utterances. So here's the network that Wentao developed and worked best on the problem. So the network is optimized for predicting each word given the passwords in the sequence, a la Elman. So like Elman, we're going to use a recurrent neural network that tries to predict what word is coming next, word WT+1, given the sequence of passwords, W1 to WT. So what this looks like when it's processing an utterance from the data set, right? The utterance might be, you want the blocks too. And how the network is going to learn from that, it's going to start with the start of sequence symbol. That's going to be passed in the recurrent net. It's going to try to make a prediction what the first word was, which is you. Then that is passed back as the input at the next step. We're going to try to predict the word that comes after that, which turns out to be want. So at every single word in the sequence, the network is going to try to predict what word comes next, given the sequence of passwords. The training is going to involve these shuffled utterances. So, we're going to do repeated epochs of training over these 37,000 utterances. I mentioned it's a recurrent network, but we're going to use something a little fancier than what Elman used on the long short-term memory network. And here are some of the details if that's of interest to you, but a much smaller scale model than the ones we were talking about in part one. And then what we're going to look at is the input word embeddings, shown here in light blue. We're going to learn a vector representation for each of the different words in isolation and analyze the syntactic and semantic structure that might be evident in the way that the model learns to use these words. So the model starts off with a random embedding, a random vector for all these different words. It knows nothing about the difference between different classes of words. And we're going to see what structure emerges from just experience with the statistics of the language that the child actually gets. But we're going to look at those light blue vectors, where these dark blue vectors here are the latent vectors, but we're going to then focus on these input vectors. So we're also going to follow Elman in examining those learned lexical categories. What does the network learn? Well, in this case, syntactic lexical categories emerge from just learning to predict the next word from the previous word, mirroring what Elman found in his simple experiments. So what you see here is a low-dimensional projection using t-SNE of the word embedding for each of those different words. Here we're going to look at the 24 most common nouns and also the most common transitive and intransitive verbs in the corpus. And if you look at this low-dimensional embedding, you'll see there's two broad clusters, right? You have nouns here in blue, and then you have verbs over here on the right. And there's actually subclusters. There's a subcluster for transitive verbs and intransitive verbs, right? Where transitive verbs require a direct object, like I make lunch or I push the cup, where intransitive verbs don't, like I work or I stand. Initially, the network doesn't know anything about the difference between these different types of words, but it's evident in the emergent structure of its representations. Another way you can view this is with a hierarchical clustering approach, where you merge nearby words and see what the broad cluster structure is in the data set. And again, you can see this noun versus verb separation is very clear, although there are a couple exceptions here or there. The network also learns semantic structure. So now we take common nouns and we're going to label them by their semantic category. Again, with the same low-dimensional projection. So you can see here in orange, different types of food and drink, like water, bread, banana, eggs, are clustered together. We go over here to the dark blue, we'll see there's a cluster of clothing, like shoes and socks and pants and shirts. And over here in red, a cluster of body parts, like hand, foot, head, and mouth near the clothing, which makes sense in terms of their semantic neighbors. And up here in pink, the different types of animals. So there seems to be a clear taxonomic structure in the subclusters, but interestingly, it's not entirely taxonomic. There's also some thematic relations that influenced embeddings as well. So one puzzle initially was when we looked over here and noticed that cow and farm and truck and milk were all together, and cow is not with the other animals and milk is not with the other food. So what was going on here? But if you recall, actually, in this example that I walked us through at the beginning of this particular moment between parent and child, where they're reading this book about milking cows on the farm and putting the milk in a truck, this seems to be a favorite book. This book is read repeatedly throughout the data set, and actually enough so that it influences the learned representations and learns a cluster for cow, farm, truck, and milk. So it is quite fascinating to look at the experience the child actually got and how that influences the representation that these networks learn. Next, we asked that the lexical classes actually interact with the network behavior. And we use what's known as the closed task, which is quite popular. It's basically a fill in the blank task. Of course, the network seems to have these emergent lexical categories, but do they use those categories? Are they more than just epiphenomena? And thus, in this closed task, we want to evaluate whether the network can predict the class of word that's going to come next in a blank, and in particular, whether it's a noun or a verb. So in the closed task, we take a sentence from the test set, like we should blank on some lights, And here in this case, we're going to mask out one of the verbs, and we're going to ask the network to evaluate the probability that various words would be used to fill in that blank, given the rest of the words in the sentence. So in this case, the top 5 predictions from the network in terms of their probability are all verbs, and it's pretty confident it's we should put on some lights, but the right answer actually turned to be we should turn on some lights. But nevertheless, it knew a verb was coming, and the network is 98% overall correct on knowing whether or not a noun or verb is coming in these closed trials we created. You take the same sentence and say we should turn on some blank, and now it knows to expect a noun. And in particular, it actually had the most likely prediction as the correct one, like we should turn on some lights, but it also thinks we should turn on some toys as a possibility. We also investigated sensitivity to sentence level syntactic structure. And this is a more involved test, and I'm just going to give you 1 or 2 examples from it. But the general paradigm is a minimal pairs paradigm, where 2 very similar sentences are presented to the network, but one's grammatical and one's ungrammatical. And we ask which sentence in the pair is more likely according to the network model. The evaluation is called Zorro, and it's a test suite of 13 different linguistic phenomena that's been used to test other models that are trained on realistic natural data. And we can compare the LSTM model highlighted here in green, the accuracy on the x-axis, the different tasks are on the y-axis, with simple models trained on the same baby's experience, whether it's a unigram statistical model or a bigram statistical model, or a transformer model that's used as an upper bound, is trained on a lot more data from many kids, and see where the model trained on this one baby falls in terms of performance. So I'm just going to highlight 2 evaluations in particular. The first is determiner noun agreement. So you get pairs of sentences like look at the silly guy versus look at the silly guys. And to make consistency between the determiner that and the noun guy, you would want to go with the first sentence rather than the second one. And turns out that the model is able to pick this up, not perfectly. So it's weakly sensitive to this type of structure, but about 70% of the time. Worse than the upper bound, but better than the simpler models. For subject-verb agreement, the horse by the bear is early versus the horses by the bear is early, where horses and is now are inconsistent. This is much harder because there's more words intervening between the subject and the verb in general. It's still better than chance, better than the baseline models. But it seems to be weakly sensitive to this type of structure when there's a lot of intervening words. So just to conclude this part, based on language-only training, solely from one child's experiences, the neural network can form emergent clusters of words corresponding to syntactic and semantic categories, and they seem to use these categories in next word prediction. And the network can also acquire sometimes weak sensitivity to sentence level syntactic structure, like some of the agreement examples or argument structure in some of the other evaluations. Again, I'll pause for a moment to see if there's a question or 2 before I get to the last part.
Well, Just to fill the blank, I'll have a go. So far, correct me if I'm wrong, starting with supervised and self-supervised learning through the second part, which was almost generically transformer GPT type of thinking. Not, I guess it's based on Elman, but it's gone to where we are now. I wanted to ask you, so far, do you agree?
Yes.
Okay, so what I want to ask you is, do you really believe this is it?
Well,
okay. So I mean, for psychological experiments, for industrial applications, it's very useful to find this kind of thing because it's useful. But if you're doing cognitive science, you're trying to figure out how the child's eyes and mouth and other people's eyes and mouths, etc., mouths give the child the competence that it has. Is this the way?
Okay, thanks for the question. And it's, I think one we should probably talk about most in like the general discussion at the end. I mean, I don't think it does not answer all of our questions. There are a lot of limitations, and I'm going to talk about that in the last couple slides. But I think the limitations are only pointing to the fact that if we had better cognitive models and we had more complete data, we'd be able to learn more than we did here rather than less. Now, this isn't a cognitive model. This is a generic neural network that's used in machine learning applications, a wide variety of machine learning applications. And we're testing the question of learnability, right? And I was surprised by the degree of structure that we can learn. Now, that doesn't prove that children learn it in the same way. We don't have evidence of that in our work so far, right? But it does show what is learnable and what's more learnable and what's less learnable. And I think that is a really important cue for figuring out like what might come relatively easily through large statistical learning on the real input and what doesn't, right? Not just what we have learned here, but also what haven't we learned here. And I'm focusing on what we have learned, but it's just important what we haven't. And those, I think, are the going to be the clues for the inductive biases that are going to be able to really turn this more into a cognitive model and reach the fuller range of abilities that even infants have in the early ones.
Thanks. I know it was premature, but I wanted to plant a seed in the blank time to think of some things.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So the last part is driven by Wei-Qing Wang, a postdoc in the group, and it's going to be about joint visual and language learning, bringing together the two threads from the previous two parts. So here, can a model learn words through a child's eyes and ears? There's a lot of challenges to this. So word-referent mappings in general, the mapping between the word and the visual referent are ambiguous in individual utterances. So children and networks must engage in a type of cross-situational word learning in order to solve this problem. And this has been studied in developmental psychology by Chen Yu, Linda Smith, and others for a number of years. But the basic idea is if you take any given visual scene and you just say like, there's a ball and a cup, or where's the ball, where's the cup? You can't know from that one scene for sure what corresponds to what. And it's the integration of experiences over time and those correlations that can help disambiguate what words map to what reference. Many utterances are short and uninformative. Here's an example, just like, oh, if you look at child-directed speech, there's a lot of this. And the meaning of an utterance, it can't always be determined in isolation and can depend on the previous utterances and the modeling we're going to do next. They are just going to treat one utterance at a time. But in a sense, this is taking cross-situational learning from the lab to the real world. So what is cross-situational learning? I mentioned it at a high level, right? But this ability to learn word-referent mappings across ambiguous scenes and utterances. So to show you the type of experiment that Smith and you have run with children as young as 12 months of age, is you would show a scene like this with two objects and then play a recording of two different words like dax toma. And you don't know which one's the dax, which one's the toma. The order is arbitrary, right? And then next, it's another scene, and you hear Toma gloop. And the thought being that since Toma was in both scenes, the word, and the green object was in both scenes, hopefully you can infer a mapping that the green object is probably called a Toma. And it turns out that babies in the lab can learn these types of mappings. And Wei Qin, who I mentioned led this section of work, has trained the same types of neural networks on this in the lab-based paradigm on the same types of stimuli, and found that even through one sequential pass through a lab experiment, these models can learn the same types of mapping. So that's another paper that you can check out. What we're doing here, though, is bringing it to the real world, and we're not using the simple laboratory stimuli anymore, and we're going to learn from this data, the language and visual stream paired together. So here are the key papers. On the left is Wei Qin's cognitive science article that you can check out if you want to hear about those laboratory studies. And on the right is a preprint coming soon, which is going to be about this grounded real-world cross-situational learning. So Wei Qin developed the Child's View for Contrastive Learning, or the CVC model. And this model is going to take an image X and encode it with the visual encoder. So the experiments I'm going to talk about used a convolutional neural network rather than a transformer, but it's the same idea. You could have done it either way. And you're going to get a single vector representation of the image. We're going to use the pre-trained model from the first part of the talk, trained in exactly the same way. And then we're going to have a language encoder, right, which is going to take an utterance like, look, there's a baby that was paired with this frame previously. It's going to encode the text as a single vector as well, of the same dimension as the image. And we're going to do something very simple here. We're going to largely treat this as a bag of words, and we're going to average them together, but we have a different vector for each word. This is very similar to CLIP, if you know that model from OpenAI, although they have a more complicated text encoder. It's very much following the same prescription that the large-scale multimodal models use as well. So we calculate the cosine similarity between sets of vectors that matched in the original data, right? So we're going to take the vector for image X and the vector for utterance W, which corresponds to V and U here. And we want those vectors to be similar, to have a high cosine similarity. And then for another pair that matched, like now it is a big ball with this image, we want those vectors to have high similarity. And while doing that, the network is also going to try to make mismatching pairs dissimilar to one another. So this image paired with this utterance, or this image paired with this utterance, will hopefully have low cosine similarity. So that's its loss function is going to be based on that. If we're using specifically InfoNC, if that is something you're familiar with, right? Going to push the positive vector pairs together and the mismatching ones away from each other. Let me tell you how we evaluate acquired word-referent mappings. So we're going to take the same set of evaluation images from baby S. So there's 26 categories, 4 that weren't commonly enough used in the actual corpus of language. And we're going to construct 4-way classification trials, which are a lot like how children are tested for word learning in the lab, where you say, like, which one is the ball? And you present 2 or 4 choices, and either the child or the network is going to select which of these images corresponds to the label. In this case, there's no decoder, no fine-tuning. There's no extra linear classifier on top. CVC can directly relate words and visual reference. At least that's what it attempts to do, right? And in a way, deeply related to and inspired by Stephen's symbol grounding problem, right? So how is it that the symbols, the labels, are actually grounded to the real objects in our perception? That this network is, in a way, an attempt to do that. So the task operationalization for CVC works as follows. So you take those 4 different images, you pass them all through the visual encoder, you're going to get 4 different vector representations. You're also going to get the target label, like ball. And we're going to look at the cosine similarity between the ball vector and all of those different image vectors. And we're going to take the max. We're going to pick the image that is the best fit. And that's the one we're going to choose in that vocabulary test. But here's what we find. The overall performance is on the y-axis. So chance is going to be 25% of selection of these 4 different images. And we find that the model is well above chance, over 60% correct on this task overall across all 24 categories. The error bars are over different model runs. So a key strength of this paradigm, as I mentioned, is the generalization comes directly from the network, right? There's no need to train a linear probe and so on. And we can also compare to different lower bounds to put the performance in perspective. We offer some meaningful upper and lower bounds on performance. So the CBC shuffled model is the CBC model, but with broken correspondence between the visual and language streams. If we shuffle those streams, we're no longer to learn anything useful in terms of word-referent mappings. And for the CBC model with random features without that visual pre-training, and with fixed random visual features, we also do much worse than the 61% you get from the multimodal model. You can compare against upper bounds on expected performance. So if you look at here in green is the CLIP model, which is this web scale multimodal neural network that you can use from OpenAI that's been pre-trained on a tremendous amount of data, 400 million examples of image and text pairs. And this model is out of distribution, right? It hasn't been trained on baby headcan data, but nevertheless, it's not too far from the CBC model when CBC is trained within distribution. We can also compare against the linear probe. So this is basically the approach from part 1 of the talk, where we take the pre-trained vision model backbone and train a linear probe on top. But this is going to use an unrealistic type of supervision, which is why it is an upper bound. And you can see that what the gap is 81 compared to 61 when you have this stronger unrealistic type of supervision. Okay, so here are the results broken down by category, and I know I'm running low on time, and I'll say a little bit more about why some classes are learned better than others in a couple slides. But you can see some of the most high performing categories are sand, crib, car, paper, stairs, and so on. The low performing categories are like toy, basket, room, and hand. It's more to do with ambiguity than it is with word frequency. So word frequency is not a major factor in predicting what word is learned better than the others in this data set, which is interesting. I'll say more about this in a couple slides. In terms of another way to evaluate these word-referent mappings, we can produce a plot that looks like this, where we can do a embedding of thousands of the frames in the data set. In particular, we're going to do the ones that have these labels, and we're going to label all the ones that have sand in it here in blue, right? And then we can look at the top predictions from the CBC model when you're taking that sand embedding and looking at the cosine similarity with the different images. And there's a nice mismatch in terms of a number of these different categories in terms of what the model thinks are the category, and also the underlying cluster structure of that category. The sand you'll see is very visually homogeneous, right? Usually those labeled images have a lot of sand in them. For the stairs, there's actually 2 distinct clusters that CBC is able to pick up. There's a cluster like outdoor staircases and a cluster of indoor staircases. This type of subcluster category structure is talked a lot about in the categorization literature, but interestingly here, you can capture it with just a single prototype for the word embedding, right? Prototype paired with this complicated neural network, but it's sort of an interesting way of getting at that type of category substructure. For the puzzles, there's also 2 different clusters that we're pointing out here. This cluster is all this letter puzzle that the child is fond of, and over here is image-based puzzles. But again, the same word can pick up those 2 different types of clusters. We examine generalization in completely new visual exemplars. You can think of this as a type of outer distribution generalization, or sometimes called zero-shot generalization. We're going to look at these objects in isolation on white backgrounds, but the network has not seen this type of data during its self-supervised learning, so it's doing this out of distribution. And nevertheless, we're going to look at 64 categories like butterfly and bucket and button and spoon that do occur in the language input that the child gets. So overall, the CBC model is about 35% correct so lower than in the within distribution task. But for 58 of the 64 classes, it's above the base rate. And I'm going to highlight a couple of classes that we're going to look at a little bit more detail here. The y-axis is performance, where the butterfly, the bucket, the button, and the spoon as spanning a range of the easier and harder classes. And what you can do is dig in and figure out the type of generalization that CVC would have had to make in order to get this right in a classification task. We can actually go in and look at the training examples of the different butterflies. There were 23 uses of the word butterfly in the corpus, and look at what the frames were that correspond to them. So this is what the model was trained on, and these are the generalization exemplars. It's able to generalize to butterflies that look different degrees of similar to the type of experience that the child actually got. And this is the accuracy when that stimulus was paired with 3 others in that vocabulary test. You can look at the buckets where you get examples of you want to pour that in a bucket, and there's a bucket and the types of buckets, and that it was asked to generalize to, where some don't really look like rusty old buckets that aren't really the type of buckets that a child would hopefully be playing with, and this one has like a weird lid on it, and it was harder to detect. For the buttons, included both buttons in books, buttons on clothes, buttons on traffic lights, right? And it's rather poor at the funny looking buttons, but did make some generalizations to other buttons. And spoons turned out to be very difficult, and we're not sure if this is because they are hard, they're smaller and harder to see, or they're highly ambiguous in the training data. I should have said that the first 2 columns were the 2 best exemplars in terms of performance, and then we have the median exemplar here, and the worst exemplar was the one on the right. Okay, I have like a couple more slides, so that's okay.
That's fine, keep going.
Okay, all right. So we'll examine general visual verbal alignment is another thing we can look at in this model. So what CVC is doing, right, it is learning a joint embedding space between the visual stream and the verbal stream. So it can place images and words in the same vector space, and we can look at that type of overlap. So what we do this, and we're looking at the image prototypes for these different labeled categories, as well as the label for those categories, and we do a joint T-SNE embedding, which is going to project this down into 2D space. So the blue here are the visual prototypes for the classes, and they're connected by the dotted line to the label, which is a different embedding, and this is the embedding for the verbal label, right? And one thing you'll notice is that there is a nice correspondence. The label is often near the prototype of the category, which is good. That's what we want to see. And actually the closeness of the label and the prototype is very strongly predictive of what categories the model is good at. So it's going to be good at car and good at road and good at computer and good at sand, because the label here in green is very close to the image prototype, but it's not very good at foot, and not very good at hand, and not very good at kitchen. And you can use this alignment, again, to dig in a little bit deeper. If you look at the best class, which was sand, and the worst class, which was hand. And sand, I mentioned, is highly homogeneous, very similar features in the different images. But hand is highly diverse. And there's hands in lots of different scenes. They're not always labeled in the other scenes, right? And they can be in the sand, and they can be playing with toys, and they can be playing with food. So there's more ambiguity. It's a harder cross-situational learning problem, but it's also a harder test to make, right? So in our vocabulary test, it's quite possible that sometimes hand would appear in an image that isn't the target hand image, because it just so happened to be a hand playing in the sand, right? So we're still trying to fully fully disentangle this and figure out to what degree for those highly ambiguous stimuli is it a problem of the learning or a problem of the evaluation. So to begin our conclusions, let's go back to some of the questions at the heart of this work. What is the origin of early knowledge? How much knowledge arises through generic learning mechanisms applied to sensory data, and how much requires more substantive, possibly innate inductive biases? So via visual input, neural nets can acquire high-level visual features that are broadly useful across a range of visual tasks, and they're also capable of high-fidelity generation when trained at scale. Via language input, the networks can acquire meaningful clusters of words and sentence-level syntactic sensitivity. And via visual and language input, networks can acquire word-referent mappings from tens of noisy examples and align their multimodal conceptual systems. So taken together, our results show how sophisticated visual and linguistic representations can arise through data-driven learning applied to one child's first-person experience. But of course, I need to acknowledge the many limitations of our work so far, and this is the last slide. That SACAM is a remarkable, unprecedented resource that captures one child's experience. It's amazing. Check out the paper, check out the data set. But it's still a snapshot of the experience of one child. And we treated the video as isolated stills, which is a limitation. There's no taste, touch, smell, sound. For the sound, we only have transcripts. The network must learn passively from a child's fundamentally active and embodied experiences. It's a major limitation. The network doesn't have desires and goals, doesn't explicitly perceive desires, goals, and social cues from others, right? It's just concerned with the particular self-supervised task that we give it. And networks don't realize language is a means of achieving wants. And I have a 2-year-old at home, and that is his favorite use of language, right? Is to get the snack he wants or whatever toy he wants. The network doesn't want anything and doesn't understand that other people have wants, right? So given these limitations, I want to leave you with this final thought. Sophisticated representations are learnable, even with these limitations. So what are the limits? What would richer cognitive models applied to denser data be able to achieve? Thank you.
Thank you. Why not give the first question to Pierre, who asked it in the chat? You ready, Pierre?
Hi, Pierre. You might be muted.
On t'entend pas. Non, toujours pas.
OK, j'ai dû peser 2 fois sur le bouton.
Ça va.
It's fantastic, Brenden. You really have a very nice approach. But the problem is still that you define the problem of understanding the baby's mind, brain, whichever way you want to call it. And then you switch to transformers, and you say we will use what the transformers can do best and see how that does the same as what the baby would do. And that's very nice at the behavioral level, but it doesn't give you really an understanding of how the baby does it. So we're still cut at the same place. I don't know, over the Leibniz gap or the grounding problem or whatever you want to call that. Aren't we?
Well, it depends what you define as progress, I think. And no, I appreciate the comment. So this does not show that this is the way that children learn these abilities. But what it does show is what abilities, what representations are learnable given a impoverished snapshot of what children actually get and the machine learning tools that work well today, right? But given that, and then you can make the leap that given that we know children have a much richer actual experience and their models are much better than these transformers, right? That speaks to, I think, what is learnable, what they actually do learn from their environment. I mean, you can make the extrapolation there, but we're not proving that this is the way that children actually learn these abilities because we didn't develop those types of models, right? The models don't have various psychological plausibility constraints and abilities put into them. And I think that is, like, we shouldn't stop with this. This doesn't answer the fundamental question of how children develop, how they learn, how their mind gets to where it is, but it provides a really useful hint, right? And if you were to study or deposit a key set of inductive biases that you think are needed for children to develop or where they start and where they end up, right? This gives you a clue for where you might pick those inductive biases to be, and not an inductive bias to acquire broad visual patterns, which you can get with these generative transformers, right? And high-level visual features really do come along with this type of learning, and also broad lexical classes and sensitivity to some syntactic constraints, right? Those seem to come with this type of learning, but everything else, right? The ability to share, understand an intention, to link intentions to your language, to link the language to flexible concepts. That we don't see here, at least we haven't been able to find it. And that's an important clue.
I agree, but shouldn't we start looking downward instead of continuing to generalize functionality and scaling up? It's not because we have zillions examples that we'll find anything better if we agree that the base is not exactly right.
Well, I do hope this top down and bottom up and the different approaches can work together and make progress to answering those questions, right? And I see this as, an approach that, like, frankly, is new and is only available now given the data set and the learning tools, but complements the many decades of careful developmental work that got us to where we are in terms of the understanding of the infant mind by trying to distill those mechanisms and build them up, right? But eventually you can only test children that are so young, and then you still don't know, like, exactly where that certain representation comes from, right? You can have hints that it might be more nature or more nurture, but I think this tool is really helpful to figure out what is easily learnable and what's not.
Agree. Thank you.
Go ahead, Alberto.
Hey, thanks so much. It was a very cool talk, very inspiring. And I also really like the conclusions that you were able to draw, but also the knowledge of the limitations. But it's very exciting to see this kind of emergence of structure from such small data sets overall. I was wondering, I mean, I guess this is work in progress. I'm wondering whether you are planning to also test these models using children-like experiments, behavioral experiments. So rather than just comparing with maybe other classifiers or ImageNet trained classifiers, whether you are actually probing your models with experimental tools.
Yeah, that's a great question, and the short answer is yes, we're doing that. We want to do more. I do think that's a really good way to make the link between how might this be useful as a cognitive model and how might it be like exercise and learnability, right? So a bit more to Pierre's question. And certain things like, well, I can say there is another paper which I didn't mention, which the student Guy Davidson in my lab is leading, where he took the pre-trained vision models and he ran them through some classic infant categorization experiments and sort of operationalized it as as much as possible, like the way infants saw the stimuli in a situation paradigm. When he was looking at like these Paul Quinn studies for relation categorization, like for really simple stimuli, can you tell that an iPhone is above my arm or below the arm? Or like are two stimuli that have the same relation more similar than two stimuli that are physically equal distance but are in a different relationship? And it turns out that the vision models do this surprisingly well. So they really are categorical in the way they categorize, that they perceive these simple relations like above and below and even between versus outside. And it paralleled some of what we know about infants' development of those categories. So above and below is easier than like between, and that's true for babies, it's true for the models. There's certain types of abstractions which make it harder for babies in the models. That's just one example where we do this type of thing. So you can check out Guy's paper for that. But you could run through the whole a whole repertoire of studies of infant categorization or infant word learning and try to test the models in the same way. And I think that is what we should do next.
Yeah, thanks. Very cool. Yeah, are you planning to release your trained models?
Yeah, I should say that they're already released. So Amin, actually I see Amin on the call, so maybe Amin can paste in the chat a link to his GitHub where you can actually download these pre-trained models today if you wanted to.
Come on.
Thank you. Super cool.
I mean, can you reply?
Yeah, we probably need to find the link, but if not, I can send it afterwards. Oh, there he goes. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Amin.
Are there other questions? Oh yes, Arseny, go ahead. Is that a raised hand or just an icon? I can't tell.
It was just an icon, honestly.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank you for your talk, and it was everything I was hoping you would do, and not more than I thought you would be able to do. I wanted to just leave a few observations. One is you started your talk by saying almost, I mean, you were sort of anticipating all of the objections that might come later, and you were saying this is not a model in which we're concerned with psychological realism, right? Usually in this kind of talk, what people say is we're not interested in neurological realism because we're trying to model psychology. You're not modeling psychology either directly. You're rather looking at the capabilities of certain algorithms that we have. And that's interesting, but it's important to keep it in mind. I find that the way to evaluate this work and its potential is best done in the light of what's happening right now around us with ChatGPT. The same questions you would ask yourself about ChatGPT. Is this really cognition? Is this stuff that we do? Could this possibly be the way we learn what we learn? It does amazing things, and it does a lot of it by exactly the same figure completion methods that you use, whether it's visual or verbal. It's really just that. Is there something, there's something super interesting about that. That's why billions are being spent on it now by countless organizations to use it. But is there something fundamentally unrealistic about that very approach? And so it'll give us stuff. It'll give us stuff that we want and we can use, but it's going to lead us the wrong way if what we're really interested in is cognition. That's the question.
Yes. Yes, and that is a great question, and I wish I could tell you about everything we're doing in the lab. This is a major thrust of our work, but I would say the second and third major thrusts are in that other direction, right? Which are trying to distill basic cognitive ingredients that are truly missing from today's AI systems that allow us to do. Overcome some of those important limitations that I mentioned, like abstract concepts, being able to go from one task to another task, understand desires and goals and social cues, right? Being able to make compositional, systematic generalizations, learn from a single example. These are things that it's many of which it's not clear that this approach is going to get you. Where I do think, like you said, like, is there something wrong about like the ChatGPT approach? Like certainly for machine learning applications, like it's doing amazing things. So that is fine. Wrong as a cognitive model, yes, but in too many ways, I would say, and that's part of the motivation for why we're doing what we're doing here. Is you train on the entire internet and then use reinforcement learning with tons of high-level examples of human supervision. It just diverges in such a dramatic way from both the resources, but also the experience that a person, a child, can actually have when they're developing. That we know it's not a model, but there's too many ways in which it's not, right? So the control here is we say, let's try the same models, but let's do it on the real data or the best proxy that we have, right? And that tells us the way that you know what we can learn and the way it might be best applied as a model and the ways that it's not.
Very good. I'm going to give it to Pierre for the last word, but before I give up, I want to say that of these limitations that you have on the screen now, the only real fundamental one is the 1, 2, 3, the fourth one, which is, and it was what I was referring to when I said that, why are you so proud that this is unsupervised? Because the child is interacting with the world and it's getting feedback on what it does and what's right and what's wrong. And that's missing from all of this passive figure completion approach altogether.
I agree.
Here, last word.
My question is about the your fifth limitation. The network don't have any desires and goals and don't explicitly perceive desires, goals, and social cues from others. Do you have any idea of how we could address this limitation? Where would the desires and goals of the network come? And assuming that you are not putting them in as anthropological desires and goals.
Yeah. I don't know. This is a really hard one, right? But it's something really important to keep in mind when you hear people saying, like, you know, the language abilities of GPT might, you know, like that they might understand words like people do or use words like people do. People say things because they have a goal and an intention that they're trying to convey, right? So that it's really important to keep in mind. I think it might be more fruitful and more shorter term to think about, you know, putting the ability to perceive the desires, goals, and social cues of others, right? So if you were able to have modules that have those capabilities, it's tremendously important because so much of word learning, language learning is social and about inferring the intention that the speaker is trying to convey. And all these cues that children pay attention to, like the fact that, you know, they look to where the parents are looking, they follow eye gaze, and it's like the network doesn't care about any of that, and they only cares about the one objection that is trying to solve, which is like that matching problem between words and scenes, right? So if we were able to put in some of those social cognition modules that has access to in order and frame the objective in a way that is more sophisticated, that's what I would do. And I think we would learn a lot.
Okay,
Thank you very much for a very good presentation.
And
Thanks everybody.